Welcome to Decision Analyst Insider Series webinar on setting priorities for product service improvements, key driver analysis. My name is Christy Allen. I am the Marketing Director at Decision Analyst and the moderator today. Before I introduce our presenter, I have a few notes for everyone. In the handout section, there is a copy of today's presentation, and the presentation is actually called Key Driver Analysis Print.pdf, and there are also some relevant papers that you can download related to key driver analysis. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, someone will respond to your question within a day or two. Today's presenter is Elizabeth Horn, Vice President and Director of Marketing Science. Beth has provided expertise and high-end analytics for Decision Analyst for more than 15 years. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Beth.
Thank you, Christy. Key driver analysis is one of the most useful analytics in a market researcher's toolkit. Every company has limited resources in terms of time and money. It's critical that attributes that drive key market outcomes, such as purchasing and sales, are identified accurately. This helps companies decide which product or service improvements are worth pursuing. So there are several objectives that will clue you in that a key driver analysis is needed. The first one is when you seek to understand which components of a product or service influence a key market outcome. So the key market outcome can be something like purchase intent or prescribing behavior if you're surveying physicians, subscribing behavior if you're surveying cable TV subscribers, shopping behavior, and so forth. Another objective is when you seek to align management, marketing, and advertising. Sometimes these three entities are unwieldy and don't necessarily agree on what's most important. Key driver analysis can help all of these parts of the organization come together and emphasize what's truly important to the key market outcome. The next objective is to guide product development. This is critical for R&D. R&D will come to the marketing research department or even the marketing department and ask, what do I work on first? I only have so much budget. What will really move the needle for our company? And the last objective is to understand how well category consumers perceive a particular brand. Could be the company's brand versus the competition. Well, again, this is pretty important. You really do want to evaluate your brand within the context of the competition. So there are two main groups of key drivers. The first one is called stated importance, and stated importance is really an influencer that a consumer or a respondent can articulate. They can directly tell us, this is important, this causes me to purchase or not to purchase. So these drivers can be determined by direct questions within a survey. This could be ratings-based importance, or with more sophisticated techniques such as MaxDiff Analysis. The second major category of key drivers are called derived drivers, and these identify potential latent or hidden influencers of a market outcome. These are mostly developed via statistical modeling. The drivers themselves may not be those that a respondent can directly articulate. Sometimes they are. But often we do find certain factors that are not stated but very high and derived. And we'll talk about some of these methods, mostly based on regression, and we have conjoint choice modeling on the back end of the presentation. So there are many different analytic methods that you can use for key driver analysis. There really is no other analytic technique that has so many tools that can be used to discover what the important factors are. So we divided them very broadly into stated and derived importance. Stated importance, we'll talk about two techniques, the ratings-based and the MaxDiff. For derived, we have a laundry list of techniques that can be used, and we'll talk about as many as time permits. So first we'll tackle stated importance, and recall these are drivers that respondents can directly articulate to us. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with the importance scale. This is the very basic way to garner stated importance values. So you may have a number of attributes down a column, and then an importance scale across the top, and then a respondent just goes through and makes their selections, their ratings. Another way this can be done is through a multiple response list. The factors, potential drivers can be listed, and a respondent simply goes through and selects the ones that are important to them when they make a purchase decision. So the deliverables are pretty straightforward, and I'm sure everyone has seen something like this. A top two box rating can be plotted. This example is for a fictitious restaurant, and we had pretend respondents go through and rate their likelihood or the importance of various aspects of a restaurant experience on likelihood to visit that restaurant. And here we see we have three tiers of drivers. Knowledge and professionalism have the highest importance. So those might be considered the two key drivers. The next group in the middle have the same importance value, community service, price, ambiance. And the final set are relatively unimportant, cleanliness and variety. That's not to say that those two can't be worked on, but they don't have as much of a relationship to the likelihood to visit the restaurant. They might even be considered cost of entry items. So there are some advantages to this technique. It's very easy, it's very straightforward, it's time honored, and you don't have to go through a big explanation with your internal stakeholders about what this means. Fancy analytics are not required. You don't have to spend years in grad school to develop charts and to interpret them. Some disadvantages, well, we know from psychology that our motivations for our behavior are often hidden from us. It would be nice if all of us knew why we did certain things, why we purchased, why we didn't. That would be wonderful, but that's just not human nature. So these ratings-based analyses could lead us a bit astray. Also, what happens with the ratings-based analysis is there is more length added to the survey, and respondents often report that everything that we've listed in our attribute group is important. And this is not very helpful for understanding and sorting through those drivers. Also, because we're dealing with survey data, response biases play a role. What do I mean by this? Some respondents like to give all top box ratings. Some will never give a top box rating, and so forth. Our next stated technique is MaxDiff Analysis, and this attempts to be an improvement on the ratings-based analysis. Instead of rating on, say, a 5-point scale, a 7-point scale, we serve up small sets of the attributes. We can imagine there are 16 total attributes, and we're planning to show them in small sets of 4. It's much easier to go through. A respondent sees one of these little sets and simply reads through the 4 attributes and selects the one that's most important to their decision and the least important to their decision. Very simple task. They repeat this. They can repeat it 15, 16 times. Each time on the screen, the attributes change out according to an experimental design. And for the analysis, you can use a choice modeling technique called hierarchical Bayes. and it estimates relative importance for each respondent. And from these relative importance values, we can rank and produce a relative ranking of all of the attributes. What's good about this technique is it gets away from the ratings-based problems such as response style bias. The task is also definitely easier for the respondent than producing, say, rating something 20 times or ranking that many items. That's a difficult thing for people to do. Some disadvantages: MaxDiff is still a stated importance technique. It's very valuable, but it's still stated, so it may not uncover those hidden or those latent drivers. MaxDiff does increase the survey length. Of course, we do feel that the trade-off is that the data is better and respondents tend to be more engaged. But there remains the fact the survey is a little bit longer. Also, analytics time, additional analytics time may be required. Could add additional time to your project. So now let's switch gears and talk about derived importance. And recall, these are the hidden or the latent drivers. The first technique to talk about is correlation analysis, and for many researchers, this is really the workhorse of key driver analysis. And this is based on attempting to relate statistically one variable to another, in particular an attribute to an outcome. This analysis is known as a bivariate analysis, so we have two variables rather than 3 or 4 or 5. So we're only relating one attribute to the outcome, and we repeat the process until we calculate correlations for all of the attributes. Now, these correlation values do give us an indication of both the magnitude or the size of the relationship to the outcome, as well as the direction or the sign of the relationship. So negative relationships with an outcome variable will calculate to be negative, or negative values that range from -1 all the way up to just shy of 0. So these relationships are basically indicating that as, say, price or perceptions of price for a product go up, the likelihood of purchase will go down. So the variables move in opposite directions. A positive relationship indicates that there is a direct relationship. So as purchase intent goes up, so does perhaps perceptions of value for the product. The higher the value, the more likely you will purchase it. So here's some typical results for correlation analysis. It's possible to plot the actual raw values. We find, though, that internal stakeholders can become confused by those values. They look sort of like percentages, and that is not what that value is. So often we will, instead of showing the actual raw values, we'll index them to the average correlation. So the product properly prepared value is in fact telling us that it's 13% more important than the average correlation. So if a fictitious retailer were to field this kind of study and these were the results, they would be able to say, oh yes, the product properly prepared, that is the top thing to work on. And then we have issues with working on knowledge and assistance and explanation from the salesperson. But that's not the complete picture. Another display to garner even more information is the derived importance performance map. Some people call these quad maps. Some even say perceptual maps. But it is a very nice visual display that plots the derived importance on the vertical axis and a performance measure along the horizontal. What's nice about this is you can then divide the plot into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant has a meaning. It's usually divided using the average, and that's where the axes cross. Now we have 4 quadrants, and we can get more out of our key driver analysis. So we have clearly 2 drivers that are in what we call the needs improvement quadrant. This is the quadrant that is both high in derived importance, but low in performance. So these are important drivers, but performance is maybe not as good as we need it to be. So these are definitely opportunities, and this further helps prioritize which attributes or which features to work on first, and correspondingly which ones that would be good to keep an eye on, but you don't necessarily have to address right away. Some of these features are a variety of products available. Well, it's not rated very high, but it's also not very important, so that can be ignored for now. There are attributes up here in the upper right that are performing very well, and they're also very important. So those probably should be just maintained. And here's one that is low in importance, but it exceeds the expectation. It's high in performance. And here, perhaps a little bit less effort. It also could be a cost of entry item. So there are some advantages to this technique. It's relatively simple once you understand the direction of the relationships and the correlation values. It can be explained fairly easily, and it really is available in a lot of statistical packages. You can even run a correlation analysis in Excel if you so desire. The cons, well, it's still a ratings-based technique. So the ratings can be influenced by response biases that we've talked about earlier. Also, the values themselves can be influenced, impacted by how the inputs are scaled. What do I mean by this? Well, the attributes, suppose the attributes are rated on a 5-point scale, and your outcome measure is rated on a 3-point scale. When you correlate different measures to one another, you tend to get lower correlation values. It's just the nature of the mathematics. So it's important to be cautious. We do recommend that you keep your outcome measure rated on the same scale points as your attributes. Another disadvantage to correlation is you could identify attributes that are really not that important. And this feeds into the next point, which is correlation is a bivariate technique. That means it only looks at 2 variables at one time, the outcome and the attribute. There's no accounting for all the attributes or some of the attributes in relation to one another, and you could be missing out. So enters regression analysis, and this attempts to introduce a more modeling framework around key driver analysis. So regression attempts to explain a dependent variable, which is our outcome. And it's a function of predictors, which are usually our attributes. And you try to create a model that will tell us, well, it's this attribute and that attribute, and attribute Z altogether will predict our outcome. What's nice about this analysis, you receive in the end a measure of how well the model is performing. How much variability are we accounting for in our outcome using the set of attributes or predictors. And this particular statistic that we look at is called an R-square. And that's simply the measure of how well the predictors explain the outcome. The higher the R-square value, which ranges from 0 to 1, the better the regression is actually capturing what's going on in the data. So here's an example output of a regression analysis. You don't necessarily have to explain all the mathematics behind it to your stakeholders, but what you can show them is the attributes that were selected to be part of the model explained, at least in our example, almost 2/3 of what was going on in the outcome, almost two-thirds of the variance. And from that, in our example, 65%, out of that we have a breakdown of the importance of individual predictors. So we know, for example, that knowledge is 20% of what's going on or predicting what's happening with the outcome, which could be purchase intent. Professionalism is the next most important predictor, and so on. It's easy then to let your stakeholders know, again, you need to concentrate on the salesperson knowledge, professionalism, perhaps perceptions of community service for the whole organization. And that variety and cleanliness and ambiance, they're probably, on a whole, it's important to have a clean facility or a clean restaurant or retail store, but that's not what is really driving purchase intent. A word about the unexplained variance. Now, what I usually like to tell internal stakeholders is that the unexplained variance doesn't mean that you didn't include all the relevant attributes in the survey. What it could point to, and in fact likely does, are the other factors that are outside the control of your company. Factors such as economic growth and contraction, competitive activity, geopolitical concerns, the weather, anything that you could imagine that you don't have control over that impacts purchase or some kind of market outcome. And there are advantages to regression. So it does attempt to account for that complex relationship among the attributes through a modeling framework. This approach is superior to correlation analysis for that reason, and from a theoretical point of view, that market performance is explained simultaneously by many attributes, which just even face validity would tell us this method's going to work better. Also, this analysis is available in standard statistical software. Again, just like with correlation, you can run a basic linear regression in Excel if you would like. But there are some significant disadvantages. Regression based on ratings also can be impacted by the scaling of the inputs. And this means that your attributes really do need to be rated on the same scale as your outcome if you're using linear regression. It can identify attributes that are not important. It's less of an issue here with regression than it is for correlation. It can also produce what we call nonsensical results. And this is what happens through an issue called multicollinearity, which is really a fancy term for attributes that are highly related to one another competing for attention in the regression. So it's kind of like in a loud crowd, you can hear just sort of a general dull roar, but it's hard to pick out that one person that you're really trying to listen to. What you can do with this is, if you suspect this is happening, what you'll usually find is you'll get a regression value or a beta weight that has a nonsensical sign. In other words, as perceptions of price go up, purchase intent goes up. That may be nonsensical if you're working in a category that is more of a commodity. The only time when I think that relationship would actually hold is perhaps if price is definitely a signal of quality. That's not the case in many categories. That's a signal that you may want to look at your attributes again and see if you can't remove some of those that are related, very, very much so. Only one out of a highly related group really needs to be in that model. And here's a very interesting extension of the regression analysis called Ensemble Prediction. And this is gaining more and more traction because of the powerful software out there that can be used. to enhance predictive accuracy and to really get a good handle on which attributes are more important. So this is a fairly robust method. It combines thousands of models and it measures importance with holdout samples. So the attribute importance is defined as an increase in the average of a square prediction error when the attribute in the model is replaced with a random variable. Well, that sounds very good, but really what that means is a variable's importance is its contribution to predictive accuracy. And random forest regression, unlike a typical regression model, goes through several steps because there are thousands of models conducted for one analysis. In the first step, the procedure randomly samples with replacement a training data set from the full data set. So you might have 1,000 respondents available for your ensemble prediction, which usually is a random forest is used for that. You might assume that 60% of those 1,000 records, or 600, will be used as your training data set. And then you'll hold out the 400 respondents you didn't select to use as a validation once you've run your model and have built your model. In step 2, the procedure randomly then samples from the attributes. So you might have 20 attributes, but the procedure will randomly sample 3, 4, 5 attributes at a time. And this helps with the multicollinearity problem. If you have fewer attributes, that means you have less chance of encountering very highly related attributes. At step 3, you repeat 1 and 2 1,000 times. You can repeat it 10,000 times if you'd like. In step 4, you run a regression on each training data set. You calculate the prediction error and based on the validation data set. And in step 5, for each training data set, importance is calculated for each attribute that was included in that particular regression. And then we understand the predictive accuracy of each attribute based on many, many models. For all its complexity, random forest, which is an ensemble prediction technique, produces a very understandable output. You'll notice very quickly, so we're using the same attributes, that the variability in the importance is much greater. The product properly prepared has an importance value of 74%, and the last attribute, variety of products, it has an importance of 13%. You can see from this analysis that the results are very clear. There's a top tier of 3 attributes, and then there's a big gap between the 52% and 38%. This really helps your internal stakeholders then decide, oh, there are some very important things that we need to work on and some items that we can look at for later. So there are many advantages to random forest. For the first time in the methods we've spoken about, it does successfully address the relationships among the attributes. And this is because many thousands of models are run with different numbers of attributes and, in fact, different attributes. The results are averaged across all of those models to get a final importance ranking. And this model does focus on the most impactful attributes, and it's, in fact, we've shown, and we'll see later, it's very good at identifying really the top attributes. But there are some disadvantages, just like with any technique. It can be impacted by response bias because it is still influenced or based on ratings data. Also, the software to produce these regressions is not really widely available, and it's not necessarily well understood by the average analyst. It does take some study. We think it's well worth it. But currently, the R language, which is an open source platform, has many routines that can be used for this. SPSS has a limited set of Ensemble Prediction available, but it is in their regression module. So our final technique is choice modeling. Choice modeling is something very natural because all of us make choices every day. So this modeling technique is built on the simple premise of we're trying to imitate exactly what's going on in the market as much as we can within an online or maybe a central location in-person environment. So here's an example of a choice exercise. We can imagine that our client is a vehicle manufacturer, and this manufacturer wants to know which features are most important to include in the new model update. So instead of asking respondents to rate the importance of the features or even to select their most and their least important to purchase, we're presenting these options as more of a realistic choice. In particular, in this example, we have two options, an option set J and R, and they differ by the features. We also have pricing for the options. In this example, additional price over the base level of vehicle price. And with this information, the respondent looks through and decides to select one over the other, and then can rate how likely they would be to purchase or lease a vehicle if it had those features. A respondent would do this, in our example it was 12 times, they could do 8, 15 times. And we use those choices and model the choices on the back end to understand what the feature importance is. So choice modeling, hierarchical Bayes estimation, yields utilities which can be thought of as beta weights or measures of importance. Sometimes they're also called measures of preference. Again, what's nice about these techniques is they may be relatively complex on the inside, but the output or the results can be very easily digested. So in this example chart, R&D can now see that the premium audio system, the standard engine, and the stereo with 6 speakers are the top 3 most preferred attributes. And that, along with the pricing information shown in the choice task, can be melded with a willingness to pay so that the client or the company can now set some R&D priorities. So there are advantages to the choice modeling technique. The attributes, the features, they're evaluated within the context of an actual purchase decision. This is much more natural, it's easier. Having the competitive impact does increase realism and increases accuracy of the output. What's also nice about choice modeling is it's not just for feature prioritization. You can use it for pricing, you can use it for market share evaluation, and so forth. Some of the disadvantages are the additional design and analysis time. So it's a more heavy lifting type of technique, and it likely will cause a need for more research budget. So now let's look at our case study, and this case study comes from a medical device category. And so for this study, we surveyed healthcare professionals. They evaluated several medical device attributes using a MaxDiff exercise. Then the same attributes were rated in terms of importance. And then we used performance ratings of several brands within this category. And finally, a likelihood to recommend or specify for each of those brands. From all of this data, we looked at, analyzed 3 different key driver analysis techniques. We, of course, looked at the MaxDiff. We developed a correlation analysis that correlated the attribute ratings of performance with the likelihood to recommend. We also looked at random forest regression. And the random forest used the same data as the correlation analysis. Of course, it's a different technique, more of a modeling approach. And we do have a blow-up slide here of the results. In the blue line are the random forest results. So these are importance results. All of these results have been ranked, sorted by the random forest. So random forest is in descending order. Now the green is the MaxDiff, which is the stated importance results. And of course they're going to be out of order because MaxDiff will yield, as a stated importance technique, different ranking than random forest. And you can easily see this. It almost looks like a sideways EKG. Random forest, for example, identified the top attribute as advanced technology. Well, over here in the orange are the correlation values or output. Correlation also identified the top driver, and it'll tend to do that. It's when you go to the second, third, fourth, fifth that random forest and correlation will start to diverge. For random forest, the second ranked driver is lifetime warranty. But for the correlation, that looks like maybe number 4. Number 3 driver in random forest is brand of the medical device supports my practice. And it looks like in correlation, that one could be number 7. So it's quite a bit lower. MaxDiff is different though. We actually have our top driver, remember this is a stated technique, is improves patients' quality of life. You typically find this in medical professional categories that healthcare professionals will point to or state attributes that are really important having to do with the patient. And after all, most of them chose to be in that profession because they did want to improve people's lives. But what's interesting is what the random forest and even the correlation point to, which is there are other factors that are hidden that are ostensibly more important to the final decision. In particular, what's interesting is the brand supports my practice. That comes out in the random forest. And not very many healthcare professionals would want to state that that is an important attribute. It's great to know this though because the internal stakeholders can now take this information and beef up their detailing or their sales rep materials and training because they know that's important. At the same time, they can provide information about how well this device improves a patient's quality of life. That's also an important thing. Perhaps that's what they should lead with, and then bring in the brand support. So our implications from market research. Out of everything we've talked about, what would be our recommendations? Well, for stated drivers, we recommend MaxDiff Analysis. This particular analysis really gets around those response style bias with ratings, the sort of modeling approach to that. It helps pull apart that stated importance. For derived drivers, though, we recommend most often the choice modeling approach. And this is because of all the other benefits as well within this technique. The features, the attributes are evaluated within the context, potentially of competition, but also of pricing and perhaps even other factors. It's a more realistic technique, it's more engaging, and the resulting importance values are certainly more believable and accurate. Now, if your budget or timing does not lend itself to choice modeling, random forest regression is a good second choice for a derived driver analysis. Random forest, robust, based on thousands of models, gets around the multicollinearity problem. And And some final thoughts for us as we wind down our presentation. Getting the most out of your key driver analysis, the garbage in, garbage out principle really applies here. It's important to have meetings with your internal stakeholders and really get them to think of which attributes to assess and put into your survey. It's really vitally important that they are concrete and actionable. Attributes like affordable price or dark purple color are very concrete and very actionable. Stay away from attributes that are more marketing oriented, such as the product makes me feel good or is a product for people like me. These attributes are useful for messaging, but not that relevant to actually improving a product. Also, some outcome measures tend to masquerade as attributes, and in particular the culprits are value and quality. These two measures are probably better suited as outcome measures because they are impacted directly by other attributes. Also, take care to word outcomes to reflect the end goal of your product development initiative. So again, help your internal stakeholders consider which outcome or outcomes they're attempting to impact. Are they trying to impact purchase intent, prescriber intent, frequency of purchase, or maybe it's product choice, or perhaps even satisfaction and retention. Also, it's wonderful to have them sit them down, have them read out the list of attributes and the outcome, and ask your stakeholders to think, ideate, what would happen if attribute 1 were the most important? What would you do? What would you be able to do for that one? If they can't give a good answer, that's a sign that that attribute or maybe even the outcome is not worded well or needs to be omitted from the survey. And the final point, a decision analyst, we often recommend qualitative work to define and refine your product attributes. Doing a little qual work up front will increase your chances of successfully identifying crisp, clear key drivers. All right, well, thank you very much for listening to us, and we do have a number of questions that you sent in, and so we'll go directly to those. So our first question is, for regression, what is a good or a target R-squared? Well, that is a good question. It does depend on your product category, depends on your sample too. When I was in academia before going into market research, we often did surveys in social psychology of college sophomores, and college sophomores tend to give very consistent results on certain psychological principles. And we would do, say, a regression analysis, and our R-squares would be much higher than 65%. And that was because of the relationship, the high degree of relationship, and the fact that our sample was relatively non-variable. They were all college sophomores. However, in the real world, when we're surveying consumers or professionals, the variability in the responses can be much higher. And if that happens, you tend to get lower R-squares. Also, if you regularly pull in non-survey data for your regressions, for your key driver, which we do quite a bit of, you do end up with lower R-squares because of the scaling issue and the dirty data issue. So it would be great to see R-squares of at least 65% in some of those cases. What's more realistic sometimes, especially with database modeling, R-squares of 35 or 40%. Okay, there's another question. What are your recommendations for sample size? It definitely depends on the technique. For ratings-based importance, for professional samples, you could go as low as 75 professionals. For a correlation analysis, you likely want to have at least 100, and certainly for regression, we're looking at 200 to 300 and more respondents. And in fact, that random forest regression works best on larger samples. And the example I talked about was 1,000. That may not be very realistic, but perhaps 500 would be more realistic. And you could test predictor sets of maybe 3, maybe 4 predictors at a time for each of your models. Okay, next question is there any value to looking at both stated and derived importance together? And that's a great question. Yes, there very much is value in looking at them both. Often, though, a researcher doesn't have the luxury of including both. For stated importance, you have to have either a MaxDiff or importance ratings, and that adds length to your survey. So in those cases, we like to just recommend derived importance. It kind of works, performs multiple functions. For derived importance, you have brand ratings of performance. So you have that you can, insights you can glean from that, and then you can do your derived importance analysis based on that data. That's usually the most judicious use of your importance real estate, if you will, in your survey. And we have a final question, which is, if you had to choose one type of importance, which would you choose, stated or derived? That one's pretty tough. I do like both, looking at both of them, but we don't often have that luxury. Derived importance is typically industry-wide more believed, simply because humans are not good at discerning, understanding their own motivations for behavior. So for the most part, I like derived better than stated, but looking at them both together, like our previous question, there's a lot of value in that, and in our case study, we saw that there definitely were different drivers for stated and derived. If you have a category where you suspect that might be true, it's a good idea to look at both types of importance. Okay, well, thank you so much for participating and for the questions. I'm going to hand the presentation over back to Christy.
Thank you everyone for attending today's Insider Series webinar. If you would like a copy of this presentation, it's in the handout section. There are actually 3 documents in there. The presentation is called Key Driver Analysis Print, and it includes the speaker notes. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email Beth. Our next Insider Series webinar will be Wednesday, February 8th. Decision analysts Felicia Rogers and Bonnie Cannoli will be presenting on what is the future of tracking research. We hope you enjoyed today's session and are looking forward to seeing you for next month's webinar. And have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.